Okay, we have some news coming out of Ukraine, and that news is coming from Poroshenko and his administration, which is making the claims, and they're, I guess you could say they're backing it up with Google Earth satellite images, that Russia is amassing hundreds of tanks on the border of Ukraine and Russia, and they are preparing to invade Ukraine. Fake news, or should we be prepared for an all-out invasion of Ukraine and see the Russians march all the way to Kiev and beyond? What's your take on this story, Alexander?
Well, putting it in that way that you've just done, Alex, obviously fake news. I mean, there is no possibility whatsoever of Russia invading Ukraine at this moment in time. And we've been hearing about these mythological Russian invasions of Ukraine that were, ever since the Ukrainian crisis began in earnest back in 2014. The Russians are not going to invade Ukraine. They're not going to march all the way to Kiev. That is not in their interests to do, especially at this time when their relations with the Western powers are already very fraught, and they're waiting to see what is going to happen in Ukraine with the elections that are due in a few months' time, and they're preparing to see whether they can work with the new Ukrainian president, who is almost certain to be Yulia Tymoshenko, with whom they worked fairly successfully in the past, and whether they can come to some kind of understanding with her to bring this really intractable conflict, if not to some kind of conclusion, at least to a more moderate position. So there is no conceivable way that the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. But that there are large numbers of Russian troops near the Ukrainian border, I mean, of that there is no doubt, and I'm sure that's been the case for a long time. I've looked at these photographs. I am not a military analyst. The military base that is shown in these photographs looks to me like a fairly permanent installation. It has probably been there for some time. Given that there was a war in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, given the threats that repeatedly come out of Ukraine, not just from the Ukrainian government, but from many other people in Ukraine, to launch further wars in eastern Ukraine against the people there, given the recent provocation we saw near the Kerch Bridge when those two Ukrainian gunboats on a tug were arrested, given the fact that just a few weeks ago the president of the Donetsk People's Republic, one of these two rebel republics in eastern Ukraine, was assassinated almost certainly by Ukrainian intelligence, it would be astonishing if the Russians were not taking the precaution of having large numbers of troops stationed there. But that should certainly not be seen as any kind of threat against Ukraine.
Right, and so the buildup, if you could even call it a buildup, the fact that there are a large number of troops, or that perhaps there are more tanks there now than there were maybe a year ago, given all the reasons that you said, plus all the NATO buildup inside Ukraine, given the fact that Ukraine is not even a part of NATO. Nevertheless, it is getting weapons from the U.S., lethal weapons now, and there is a buildup in Ukraine that I think is common knowledge to everybody now. Something like this would not be out of the ordinary to see Russia take those precautions. And so Poroshenko is obviously, peddling these satellite images, showing them to Western press to achieve what?
Well, I mean, this is, of course, fits entirely into his agenda, which is, as he's going forward towards an election which he looks certain to lose, he's trying to mobilize support both domestically and internationally by cranking up stories about the Russian threat. And we've seen that he's already imposed martial law on the eastern regions of Ukraine. These are the same regions which are, of course, overwhelmingly Russian-speaking, where the people rejected the Maidan coup when it took place in 2014, and where they want to see better relations with Russia, and where they are certain to vote against Poroshenko when he comes up for president. So conjuring up this threat, talking in this wild way about Russian tanks on his borders and threats to Kiev and threats to Ukraine from the Russians, all this is very much part of his agenda. It justifies his declaration of martial law, and of course it enables him to build up a strategy of tension within Ukraine itself, which could conceivably even end in the postponement or cancellation of the elections. I mean, that has been suggested as being Poroshenko's agenda in Ukraine itself. And there were even discussions to that effect on the floor of the Ukrainian parliament when the martial law bill that Poroshenko first proposed was brought to the parliament originally.
Right, so he's pulling out every trick that he has to try and buy some time and to try and stay in power. Paris is burning. The UK is in complete shambles under Theresa May and Brexit. Merkel is under assault almost on a daily basis now. Her power has dwindled to nothing, pretty much. You know, Italy, Greece, Spain, Europe there's no way that Europe wants to hear about Ukraine, correct?
No, correct. Absolutely right. I mean, this is a crisis that they brought on themselves. They engineered it. I mean, they insisted on this association agreement between Ukraine and Europe, which, by the way, is uncannily similar in many respects to the deal that Theresa May has negotiated with the European Union. I mean, I read through it, and even some of the paragraphs, as I said, seem to be almost identical.
Speak to that a little bit.
I mean, one of the provisions. Yeah, one of the provisions. I mean, both deals contain one of the a paragraph which is really, for me, the killer paragraph. In that it says that goods and will be regulated according to European standards. An arbitration panel will be set up to decide any disputes, but on any question of European law, the matter will be referred back to the European Court of Justice. Now, what that basically says is you set up an arbitration panel, but the real decider is going to be the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice implements European law, and European law is made not in Kiev or London, but in Brussels and Frankfurt. So what is actually going to happen is that Frankfurt and Brussels are going to legislate for Britain and for Ukraine on vast areas of their economy, with all questions decided ultimately by the European Court of Justice. Now, that is the same pattern of agreement that we have seen both Britain and Ukraine sign. Now, what has happened in both cases is that the president of Ukraine, who has maneuvered stupidly into agreeing to that association agreement, President Viktor Yanukovych, he came along to the Europeans and he said, this isn't going to work. Many people in Ukraine are rejecting this because they say we will become a vassal state of the European Union. And the European Union says we are not prepared to change anything. We're not prepared to change a single word in the agreement. Theresa May has stupidly negotiated a very similar agreement with the Europeans. She's coming back to Europe as we're speaking and saying to the Europeans, look, many people in Britain don't like it. This is unacceptable to the British there. And how are the Europeans reacting? They are reacting in exactly the same way. We are not prepared to change a single word in the agreement. Anybody who followed the Ukrainian thing and who is now following the British thing, the similarities are uncanny. What happened in Ukraine is that tactic eventually led to the collapse of constitutional order in Ukraine, to a coup there, and to a civil war in eastern Ukraine, and to Ukraine's loss of Crimea. I don't think anybody in Europe looking at this crisis in Ukraine wants to involve Europe in it any further. Britain, well, as I said, the European Union has done many of the same things, is a far bigger problem for them at the moment. And even Britain, if I have to be truthful about this, is eclipsed by the crisis in France and potentially by the crisis in Italy. Not to mention, as you correctly say, that Angela Merkel's authority in Germany is collapsing.
and on the striking the same tone, you have Theresa May apparently trying to buy time to delay the vote on Brexit, and you have Poroshenko in his own way trying to buy time for his election, which he is bound to lose. And Theresa May was bound to lose her vote as well. So you have these two leaders trying to, use these same type of buying time tactics.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a classic maneuver. I mean, this is the nature. We've discussed this, the total collapse of political leadership across Europe, that there are no political leaders in Europe that you can take seriously anymore. And Theresa May, as I said, is clinging on for a few more weeks, causing enormous misery for her country, that's to say Britain, in the meantime. If you look at the British newspapers today, by the way, I mean, the things they're saying about her are just awful. And, I mean, lots of people are making this point about her. And you see President Poroshenko, he's trying to cling on and to delay the inevitable as far as he can. And how is he doing it? He's putting his country in Ukraine in an even worse position, cranking up talk about a war with Russia. And of course, what's that doing? I mean, I've been reading articles in all sorts of places about how the Russians supposedly have imposed a blockade on Ukrainian ports in the Sea of Azov. The reason commercial shipping is not going to these ports is not because the Russians have imposed a blockade on those ports. It's because ship owners and insurance companies are not prepared to allow ships to enter an area which, if you listen to the extraordinary language that's coming out of Kiev, could very well become a war zone. So who is suffering as a result? The Ukrainian economy is suffering. Who is suffering as a result of Theresa May's maneuvers? The British economy. So two leaders, Poroshenko and Theresa May, who are sacrificing the vital interests of their countries in order to stay in power for as long as they can.
Finally, Alexander, real quick, do you think that we are going to have a proper election in Ukraine? Or do you think that Poroshenko's tactics, this one or maybe a new one he conjures up, may work?
No, we are never going to have a proper election in Ukraine because, of course, the option of a political leader standing up saying, we want to end the war in the Donbass, we want to recognize that we've lost Crimea, what we need to do is to have better relations with Russia. That kind of option, that kind of person putting forward that alternative is impossible. Anybody in Ukraine who proposed that would be putting themselves in great physical jeopardy. So already we do not have a clear and straightforward election in Ukraine. What we will have, however, is an election which will be fought out between Maidan, pro-Maidan factions, and the probability is that despite the way in which Poroshenko is trying to manipulate and control it, Tymoshenko, who is also a member of the Maidan movement, will be able to prevail over him, because support for Poroshenko in Ukraine at the moment is so low that I saw an opinion poll today. It's in an article where there's a link to it on our website. There was a poll which showed that he would even lose an election if the candidate who was standing against him was the country's most famous famous comedian. I mean, that is how bad his position has become.
All right. Well, he wanted Europe. He's become a true European leader, very much like Merkel, Macron, and May.
Well, I mean, they're all falling like ninepins, because there isn't a single leader amongst them. I mean, that's the truth of it. I mean, they are all proving completely inadequate to the situation that they're facing. None of them has any real clear way of moving forward, and none of them has the power of decision, the ability to make real decisions and to execute on them effectively.
Meanwhile, blame Russia. That seems to be the go-to scapegoat.
Well, indeed. I mean, and let's in fact just recap all that. Theresa May, she's led campaign against Russia. She's used the Skripal affair to do it. Emmanuel Macron, well, who's he now blaming for the problems in Paris? Well, not him himself, but his people. Already we're seeing that, the protests in Paris and France are supposedly being stirred up by Russian Twitter accounts. And Poroshenko, well, of course, he's talking about the Russians invading Ukraine. I mean, always it is Russia now. Russia is the absolute default bogey for any Western leader who finds himself or herself in trouble.
Yep, Russia did it. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. Go to the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, 20% off for the whole month of December. Smash that like button. Subscribe to our channel, share the channel with your friends. It really helps us out a lot. And you can also get an audio podcast of this show on iTunes and on Soundcloud. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you once again. Take care, everybody.